This is a Koenigsegg CCX, and it was the ultimate supercar from a decade ago. Yes, it's hard for me to believe it, but this came out more than a decade ago, actually back in 2006, although this is a 2008 model, and it really was the ultimate supercar of its day. Today, I'm going to review it. I've borrowed this Koenigsegg from CNC Motors, which is an exotic car dealership here in Southern California that has everything, and I mean everything. They've got everything from Ferrari supercars to Porsche GT cars to Paganis to, well, this, which is one of 3 Koenigsegg's they have right now. Their showroom is truly the most incredible of any dealership probably on the planet, and you can check out their inventory by clicking the link in the description below, and you can also find a link to their Instagram page.
And by the way, if you want to buy this Koenigsegg, it's going to be available at the RM auction in Fort Lauderdale at the end of this month, March 29 through 31, just in case you want to try some bidding on a Koenigsegg.
Before I dive into the CCX, a brief overview. Now, Koenigsegg's first production car was called the CC8, and it came out back in 2002. That was replaced by the CCR in 2004, and then this, the CCX, in 2006, which is Koenigsegg's first real global car. Now, this was sold all the way through 2010 until it was replaced by the Koenigsegg Agera, which only recently just went out of production. I have filmed a video with the Koenigsegg Agera RS, which I will link in the description below. But while the Agera is really amazing, the CCX is an interesting look back into Koenigsegg's history, in part because it was the first Koenigsegg to use Koenigsegg's own engine rather than an engine borrowed from someone else. It was a 4.7-liter twin supercharged V8 that makes around 800 horsepower and about 680 pound-feet of torque. This was also the first Koenigsegg to be sold globally, although globally is a bit of a stretch because when these were new, they cost over $700,000 and they were sold in incredibly small numbers. These days, prices have increased, and this one is listed for sale with around 1,000 miles for $1.5 million. So today I'm going to show you around the CCX, which is rear-wheel drive with a manual transmission. Yes, a true manual. And I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the ultimate Koenigsegg from a decade ago. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the CCX, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the most expensive cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Koenigsegg with a discussion of the key. Although I use the term key rather loosely because this doesn't look like any sort of key you've ever seen before in any other vehicle. Instead, it's in the shape of a crest from an old Koenigsegg family coat of arms, so you won't confuse this with a key for a different vehicle. You also won't be able to put it on the same key ring as a key for a different vehicle because it has no little loop for you to do so. I guess your Koenigsegg key is not supposed to mingle with your keys for your normal cars. Now, if you look at the front, you'll see there are no buttons. You turn it over and there is this little black rubber strip. You have lock and unlock buttons contained within that strip, and that's all you get in this key. And so now that you've unlocked the doors with your key, you got to figure out how to get in, which can be a challenge because as you look at the door, there's no readily apparent door handle. Well, actually, it's hidden under here, under the door sill. There's a little silver button. You push it, and then the doors do their thing. It is a rather unusual motion that is very different from the motion of every other car door. Koenigsegg calls it the dihedral synchro helix, but basically what it means is the door kind of moves out and tilts forward at the same time, allowing you to step inside. And you'll also notice that the window went down. That's because the window has to go down just a little bit in order for the door to clear the windshield frame so it won't smash the window as the door is open. And so that is the dihedral synchro helix in action. Now with the door open, that leads us to our next interesting point of the Koenigsegg, namely climbing in, which is actually a bit of a challenge. The door gives you a very wide opening, but the sill is absolutely incredibly wide. There's like 1.5 feet of door sill here, the largest I've ever seen, so climbing in is a bit of a challenge. What I found works best is sticking 1 foot in first and then putting yourself in, but even that isn't incredibly easy. Still, at least I got in. And now you might be wondering, how exactly do you close these doors? Well, there's a little silver piece mounted on the door. You put your hand on it, you pull, and then the door does the rest. And you probably noticed just now the window went up as the door closed. I'm gonna put the window back down, and the reason it went up is that's because the window returns to its up position after the door goes back in place, and then it no longer has to worry about braking on the windshield frame. It sort of automatically slides back up. Now, you're sitting in the car, and your next question is, how do you get out? Actually, it's pretty simple. There's just a door handle, like you'd find a door handle on a normal car. You pull it, and then kind of push forward on the door, and then once again, it does its thing, and then you can climb right out. At least in theory, you can climb right out. In practice, it's a little challenging. So anyway, next up, you figured out the key, you figured out the doors, you got yourself in. Now comes the easy part, right? Just start the car up and go. Not so fast. The starting procedure for this car is probably one of the great anti-theft devices of any vehicle. In order to start this car, it's quite a process. You have to press 4 distinct buttons in a sequence. So the first one is under the dashboard in the driver's leg area. You press that button and it sort of wakes the car up, I guess. Next, you go into the center control stack and you see this giant circle of buttons on here. You go to the bottom and you see the one with the Koenigsegg coat of arms crest on it. You press that, hold it down, and press IGN at the same time. I guess that's the ignition, and you can see and hear car systems start to go on. Then you release those buttons, you press the Koenigsegg crest coat of arms again, and you press the button to the left of that, which is the button that actually turns on the engine, and then, and only then, have you actually started up this car. Not one button, it's actually 4 different buttons, and they have to be pressed in that order. Now, if you were paying attention there, you probably noticed you don't actually put the key anywhere. You don't put it in something, you don't turn it, which might make you wonder, how can you prevent this car from being stolen? Well, obviously, part of it is just the difficulty in the starting procedure, but you can see here it says to immobilize fully, engage reverse gear. And I guess if you turn the car off and put it in reverse, the immobilizer comes on, and then it can't be stolen, and that's how Koenigsegg prevents against that. Not that any thief could figure out that starting procedure anyway. Now, the next big surprise in here will be the fact that this car has a manual transmission. Yes, a real manual transmission with 3 pedals, like an old school car, which is actually a big surprise. A vehicle with this much power, even in the mid-2000s, they were starting to trend towards sequential automatics and even dual clutches in a few cars, but this one has a manual, and controlling 800 horsepower with a manual transmission is a pretty difficult job, but the people who bought this car felt they were up to the task. It is impressive to see a 3-pedal manual in a car like this. And indeed, if you look in the driver's footwell, you can see the 3 pedals. There they are, all the same size and shape and quite close together, rather narrow. And you can also see that on the pedals is again that Koenigsegg crest from the coat of arms. And that is repeated in many places throughout this car, in case you weren't already starting to understand that. There are some places where I find it especially interesting. For example, the little storage pocket in the center console behind the parking brake is shaped like the Koenigsegg coat of arms crest. I think that is a really cool little detail and quirk. Another cool sighting of the crest is right above that. You can see the master battery cutoff power switch is shaped like the Koenigsegg crest, which is cool. Putting that there is also a pretty good idea because the people who own these cars tend to park them for a long time, so you can twist that, shut off all power, and then the battery and the systems won't drain as the car is just parked. Another sighting of the crest in this car is on the climate vents. There are 4 of them mounted in the usual place on the dashboard, and you can see this little ring around the climate vents has the crest on them, and when the crest is fully in the up top position, that's when you know the climate vent is open. If you want to close the climate vent, you move that little silver ring, and then you know that the vent is closed, or at least airflow is restricted based on how far you've turned. the little silver ring with the crest. One other place you'll find the crest, very obviously, is on the seats. You can see it is full color. Now, speaking of the seats in this car are actually fairly normal. So many cars today, they're going for crazy carbon fiber racing bucket seats, and you have to be skinny to fit in them. In this car, most people, I think, could get in here and fit in these seats no problem. They're not too aggressive, too sporty. In fact, dare I say, they're actually kind of comfortable. Now, next I want to move on to the controls in this car, which are all tremendously interesting and unusual. And I want to start with the climate controls. Now, a few of the climate control dials are similar to what you'd find in a normal car. You have the one that controls where the air is coming out. You have the one that controls whether you're doing outside air or inside, and then one that turns on the air conditioning or just blows air. But the other two dials are rather interesting. In the bottom left, you have temperature, and you can see there are no markings on that dial. And as you twist it, there is no display of what temperature you're turning it to anywhere in the car. You just have to sort of know. And so my assumption is when it's in the bottom left position, that would be cold. And when it's all the way in the bottom right position, that would be warm. And everything in between is sort of corresponding to where that little dial is positioned. But again, it doesn't actually say that anywhere. You just have to sort of know. It's the same story with the dial on the right to adjust fan speed. There's no on-off button for this climate control. You just turn the fan speed dial down as much as possible, and then the climate control is in the lowest possible setting. And if you want more climate control, you just start twisting it to the right, and then more air blows out of the fans in whatever temperature you've hopefully selected using the temperature dial. But obviously, the set of controls that you're probably most interested in is in the middle, in the center control stack, this whole big circle of controls, the wheel that controls the Koenigsegg. You may be wondering exactly what goes on in this thing. It's this big circle that's rimmed with 10 identical silver buttons. And the button at the very top turns on the headlights. If you press that, obviously the headlights turn on, but also all of the interior lights light up, and you can see that this big circle of buttons lights up in this cool greens and blues corresponding to what each thing does. I find that kind of cool. Now, the buttons to the left and to the right of the headlights also have light-related functions. On the left, you have the parking lights, and on the right, you have the fog lights, and they have little indicator lights inside the inner circle to let you know if you've turned them on. Now, when you move further down the Koenigsegg circle of life, you will find the window controls on either side. So the windows have individual buttons. There's one button to roll up the window, and then another one of those silver circle buttons to roll down the window, one on the driver's side, and another set on the passenger side to roll up or down the windows. Finally, at the very bottom, you have the three buttons that turn on the car. Like I showed you, you have the big Koenigsegg crest button in the middle, and then ignition and the engine start button to the left and to the right. Now, inside the circle, there are several other circles. The first circle has little indicators to let you know what each of these buttons do. The circle inside that has little lights that go on that let you know when various things are happening. Like, for example, if you have the headlights on, the lights will turn on. But also, if you have a door open, the door light lights up in red. And if you have the car in reverse, there's even a light that lights up very small to let you know that the car is in reverse. Hopefully you could tell that anyway because you put it there. But nonetheless, it's on just as an extra warning. Now, in the very middle of all the circles, you have one more circle, and that would be the power mirror control. So you have all of the center controls in the most expensive, craziest car of the 2000s, and they all converge in one middle point. And what does it do? It adjusts the mirrors. Pretty simple, actually. Now, next up, the buttons below the giant Koenigsegg circle of life. You have four individual buttons down here. Obviously, on the left, you have the hazard lights. Then next, you have the door locks. And as you press it, you can see it lights up red or not to let you know whether or not the doors are locked. The next button is actually a dial, and this allows you to dial in exactly how much traction control you want. And there are several different settings that you can choose, including all off. And when you choose all off, this little red light goes on to let you know you have really committed to traction control being off, and just remind you, maybe be careful when you see that red light. Obviously, the last button over here is the axle lifting system. You press that, and the car will lift up a little bit to clear low driveways or curbs. Now next I want to move over to the steering wheel area, where we have a couple of cool items, starting with the stalks that come off the steering wheel. Now I really like the feel and the look of the turn signal stalk. It looks good to touch, it looks good to look at, but my favorite part of it is when you put it on, take a look at what lights up in the gauge cluster. It isn't just an icon showing the turn signal is on, like a portion of the entire left side of the gauge cluster lights up to let you know that the turn signal is on. And obviously the same thing happens over on the right side. Put the right turn signal on and that portion of the gauge cluster lights up to let you know that the right turn signal is on. I'm not sure why they decided to do that with the turn signals, but it makes things a little bit more unique than in a regular car. And it's the same story with the high beams. If you turn on the headlights and then turn on the high beams, they also have a large portion of the gauge cluster that lights up in blue. And you can see in the upper right of the gauge cluster, there is a check engine light that I guess would also light up if you needed to check the engine. Now, next up, this car was built in the days before screens for basically every function in the interior. And that's very obvious from the sheer number of buttons and dials in this car, but there are a couple of screens, and one of them is in the gauge cluster, although it is a very simple screen that only shows on the left, you have your boost. In the middle, you have the current speed that you're going, printed digitally because this car doesn't actually have a speedometer in the traditional sense, only that digital display, so I hope it functions. And then on the right, you have your odometer and your trip odometer. Now you may be wondering, where's the fuel gauge? And the answer is, there isn't one. You don't actually have a fuel gauge. Instead, there's a little fuel light, and it comes on when it's ready for fuel, and I guess you can't monitor the current state of fuel other than when that light comes on, and then you know, okay, I'd better go put fuel in this thing. Doesn't exactly make it a very practical road trip car. There's also another little light to the right of the tachometer in the middle that has the Koenigsegg crest. I guess that probably comes on when there's some warning or issue with the car that needs your attention. And of course, right in the middle, you have the tachometer. When the car is off for some reason, it's sitting at 900 RPM, and it is not resting on the little peg that it is designed to rest on, a quirk of the Koenigsegg. Now next up we move on to the steering wheel, which is a very nice piece, very thick and bulky like you'd expect in a really nice sports car. It also has the Koenigsegg crest in the middle, of course, but over on the sides you have horn buttons. You press them and then the horn honks. Now next up over to the left of the steering wheel, you have an interesting screen over there. That's the tire pressure monitor. By the time this car came out, I think tire pressure monitors were mandated in some countries, so they had to stick that in. It looks like kind of an afterthought, which I'm sure it was, but it monitors to let you know if you have a flat tire in your Koenigsegg. Other interesting items inside this car, there's no roof as you can tell, so the dome lights had to be relocated, and in this case they put them between the seats. They're LEDs, you twist this little dial and then they turn on and light up whatever you need lit. I also like the sun visors, which are incredibly tiny and they're angled to go along with sort of the curve of the windshield, so when you put them down, part of the sun visor is further away from you, and it's kind of an odd effect. Not that it's really useful anyway, given just how small this sun visor is. Another interesting item in this car, the glove box exists, but it's open. There's no glove box door, so whatever you put in there, expect the passenger to have access to. Next up, another obvious item here. We are in an open car. It's completely open to the world, but this car has a roof. It's a convertible, and so you can take the roof off or put it on, and I will discuss that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. For now, one more important item in this car, and that would be the infotainment screen. You can see it says Koenigsegg at the bottom, so I got really excited to see what a 10-year-old Koenigsegg infotainment system was like, until I discovered that this is not a unique Koenigsegg system. Koenigsegg farmed out infotainment development to some other company, and it's hard to blame them because that requires so much thought and detail orientation and software engineering, and ultimately Koenigsegg is a car company, although they do build their own infotainment systems now. But back then they didn't, and this unit is just a generic one, probably similar to some software that you could buy at a store and just install in other cars.
One amazing thing about this infotainment system, it has a calculator, and this calculator has trigonometric functions like sine, cosine, and tangent, so you can drive down the street in your Koenigsegg and calculate sine, cosine, and tangent of your favorite angles at 200 miles per hour. And by the way, that Koenigsegg logo on the infotainment system, yeah, it's just a decal. You can pull it right off if you want.
And next up we move on to the outside of the Koenigsegg, where of course there are many more quirks and features. I want to start with one of my favorite ones, and that would be the windshield wiper, which is in its normal resting place directly in the middle of the windshield. This is an odd placement for a street car, although a lot of race cars have it like this, I think for drag, because if you have the wipers sitting horizontally, air hits them and it slows the car down just a little bit. But if you have it in this position, I guess air kind of goes in that direction naturally, and that's why they've done this. And next we move on to the wheels in the CCX, and you can see if you look closely, these are carbon fiber wheels in order to save weight. Now, carbon fiber wheels in the years since this car was built have become a little bit more common, although back then this was like rocket science technology. Carbon fiber wheels in a car, it was just crazy. Another feature this car has, obviously, is center lock wheels instead of traditional lug nuts. A lot of really high-end supercars, sports cars, race cars have this. And you can see on the center lock itself, there's a little diagram telling you which way to turn to get the wheel off. Although as I look closely, it looks like the diagram on the side of the center lock says to twist it one way, and the diagram on the front of the center lock says to twist it the opposite way. So I'm not exactly sure which is which or how this works, but someone smarter than me will be taking off these wheels, I promise you that. Now next we move around to the other side of the Koenigsegg, and I want to talk about the fuel door, which is integrated into this rear compartment, which I'm going to be opening in a second. But opening the fuel door is a lot easier than opening the rear compartment, even though it doesn't really look like it. There's no immediately obvious place to stick your finger. It turns out what you do is you push the top of the little fuel door, and then the whole thing is hinged and it moves up, allowing you to put fuel in your Koenigsegg. And of course you can see that the fuel cap has the Koenigsegg coat of arms crest on it, because why wouldn't it? Now next I want to open the rear compartment that contains the engine, and to do that, it's actually relatively simple. First you have to have the door open, and there's a little latch back here that you pull it and it unlatches the rear compartment, just like in basically any other car. Then you simply walk around to the back of it and lift it up. It's a one-person job, and it can hold itself up with these big hydraulics. Then it's up, and that's it. That's how you get into the engine compartment of a CCX. Now, obviously, when you have the engine compartment up, you can access the engine, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to talk about accessing the engine oil. You can do that through this little engine oil cap mounted right here that only is revealed with the engine compartment in its up position. In order to get in there, you basically pull up this little tab, twist it, and then you can pull off the top of the oil cap, and you can see that integrated into that top is a dipstick, and that is how you check the oil in your Koenigsegg CCX. But anyway, with the oil out of the way, now we move back here, and you can see the giant, glorious engine in this car. And you can really see it, because when you pull up the engine compartment, so much comes up that you basically have access to everything. Now, like I said before, this engine is Koenigsegg's first real, fully Koenigsegg engine. The Koenigsegg models from before this car, they used V8 engines that were based on a Ford modular V8. But this one is all Koenigsegg. And yes, like I mentioned, 800 horsepower, 680 pound-feet of torque, and it is twin supercharged, because why wouldn't it be? This car is just so ridiculous in every way. Now, a few interesting things in the engine compartment. Obviously, you see these bars going across the engine for chassis rigidity. In a lot of cars, there's bars going across the engine, but in this one, they meet in the middle, where there is, of course, a Koenigsegg crest, this one in full color. You also have an interesting label back here. There's a very large label that describes in very detailed language how to find the battery jump points for this car. I think Koenigsegg knew that their customers would not be driving them all that much, the batteries would die, and they didn't want anybody to screw up anything, so they were very clear about where all that stuff is under here. But anyway, now we have the engine compartment closed, and there are a few interesting items worth noting back here. One is the fact that that full color crest on those crossbars in the engine can be seen with the engine compartment closed. In fact, it's right in the middle, and it looks very cool and very special planted in there. Another interesting item, you can see there's a little bit of glass that allows you to look into the engine compartment, and mounted on that piece of glass, there's a little ghost. Now the story with that ghost is apparently when Koenigsegg started building cars in a certain factory, the factory had previously belonged to a specific regiment or fighter squadron of the Swedish Air Force, and they used that ghost on some of their planes, and they asked Koenigsegg kind of casually, will you incorporate this somehow into our cars and keep our tradition alive? And so they did. So a lot of the Koenigsegg models have this little ghost emblem on them, and that is why. Of course, the other important thing back here, the giant center exhaust, which is huge, massive, and of course it sounds wonderful. Take a listen. Next up, we move on to the front trunk. And once again, the opening procedure is rather interesting. Again, you have to have the door open, and then the latch is actually inside where the door hinge is, and you pull it, and that unlatches the front trunk. But when you pull that latch, you'll notice that the window drops down a little bit more. Take a look. That's because if you try to open the front trunk with the window in the position it was in, the front trunk could hit the window and break it. And obviously they don't want that. So the moment you unlatch the front trunk, the window automatically retreats all the way into the door. So it has various different placements based on what is open in the vehicle. Now, to drive that point home that you really want the window to be down when the front trunk is unlatched, there's actually a little warning label down here that you can see when the door is open, telling you to avoid operating the front trunk when the battery is dead, because then the window may not be able to go down. When you open the front trunk, you may smash the window. But anyway, now that the trunk is unlatched in this position, we come around here, and you can't pull it up, you have to unlatch it. The latch is over by the driver's side headlight. You pull it, and then you can lift it right up, and you are inside the front trunk of the Koenigsegg. And as you can see, the trunk barely clears the door, and it may not have cleared had the window stayed in its earlier position, but since it retreated into the door, no problem, it's all good. Now, one interesting item you'll notice when the front trunk is opened is the fact that the headlights go up with it. I have told you in many videos that in the United States, it is federal regulation that headlights and taillights cannot move with pieces of bodywork. But obviously Koenigsegg, being such a small automaker, they got an exemption to this rule, so they didn't have to re-engineer the entire front end of their car just to make the trunk open. Now, before we get into the trunk itself, speaking of opening things, I do want to mention this car looks very cool when everything is open. Take a look at this. This is this car when it is exploded. So much bodywork can open and be removed that it just looks like a totally alien vehicle with everything in the open position, and it's really cool to see it all. It looks very different from a regular car. But anyway, now we're in the front trunk, and you can see mounted here is the roof. This is what the roof looks like. The front trunk is perfectly sized so that it can fit in here if you have the roof off and you want to operate the car as a convertible. And you can see that placed here, sticking underneath the roof, is this rag. And that's because if you put the roof in here without the rag, the roof might scratch, and obviously you don't want to scratch the roof in your Koenigsegg, so we have a rag. You spend $1 million on a car, you have to provide your own rag. Actually, that's not entirely true. In fact, there's a little warning label here in the front trunk that says, attention, always place the roof in the protective cover before putting it inside the front trunk. So I guess there must be some protective cover that's probably complicated and annoying. You have to stick it in that, then you can put it in here, and then you won't scratch it. Or you can just go the easy way and use the rag. And so those are the many quirks and features of the 2008 Koenigsegg CCX. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive it. All right, driving the Koenigsegg. Trying to ease into it. The pedal box is real tight, a little offset, and there is not a huge amount of room for my knees. But it's incredible to drive a car like this that's a manual. I mean, this is like driving a manual Veyron, like it's an ultra hypercar with 3 pedals. Surprisingly, the clutch is actually pretty easy. It's not tremendously heavy. The engagement is really good. It actually feels pretty good. I'm shocked by this. The gear lever is also really easy to operate. It almost feels like a Porsche in its simplicity. It definitely feels like a sense of occasion in this car. Nothing is normal. The pedal box is definitely tight, tighter than I was expecting. There's a lot of sound, a lot of sound. Having the top open really helps. You really get to hear everything. It's quite impressive. That's amazing. What an incredible noise. Going pretty fast, it feels dead stable. There's no shaking or craziness from, like an early supercar. It feels like a really, really high quality vehicle, which is surprising to me. The revs are very quick. It revs fast when you're rev matching for a downshift. Impressively so. Cruising, it actually feels like a stable and almost rational vehicle. The clutch is easy to operate, the gear lever is easy to operate, and sitting here, it feels stable. It feels like a decent and normal car. Sitting in a stoplight, the car is surprisingly well done. It doesn't feel shaky or rattly or anything like that. Considering this is, an early attempt from Koenigsegg, it's surprisingly well built and it feels really dialed in and well put together. It actually feels like a reasonable car you could use. The thing that I'm most impressed by, though, is the clutch and shifter action. It's just really, really surprisingly excellent. I will say, sitting here at the stoplight, you can't see very well the traffic lights because of the windshield line so low. Oh, yeah. Man, that just feels so incredible. Going around the corner back there on the highway loop on-ramp, obviously I'm not pushing it really hard, but you do feel like the steering very stable, not light, very direct, very communicative for the car. The car actually feels like if you wanted to, you can kind of dart around and zoom in and out of traffic, but you would probably have to have a lot more money than me to feel comfortable doing that. Obviously, it's tremendously, tremendously fast. Although when you have the roof off, there's just so much wind, even with the windows up, it's just difficult to exist. The car actually is surprisingly drivable. If you weren't worried about its incredible cost and the cost of replacing stuff and other people bumping into you and blah, 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 it's actually a shockingly usable car. I feel like it's pretty easy to drive, pretty engaging to drive. Obviously it's fast, but it feels stable, it feels well built. It doesn't feel like the kind of car that you feel fragile or something driving in, except for the fact that you know how much it costs. And so that's the Koenigsegg CCX. One of the ultimate supercars of the 2000s, one of the most special cars ever made. This thing costs over $1 million. It'll do more than 240 miles per hour, and there's probably only a few dozen of these on the planet. And now you gotta see it up close. And now it's time to give the CCX a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I've always liked how this car looks, but it's more functional than beautiful, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Handling was very precise, very well balanced, absolutely excellent, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Fun factor is huge: the sound, the speed, the doors, and that amazing manual shift action. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and this one is easy. It's a total showstopper, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 47 out of 50. Next up are the daily scores and features. This car has everything you'd expect, but it's hardly loaded with modern tech, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is good enough, the seat is nice, and the driving position is decent, but seat room is tight, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality is good, better than I thought, though the pixelated display screen hasn't aged well, and servicing is surely a challenge, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is obvious, with very little cargo room, horrid fuel economy, and the crowd that will inevitably draw every time you go anywhere, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Finally, value, and it has only gone up. It's also a bargain compared to new Koenigsegg models, despite a very similar wow factor and styling, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 69 out of 100, and here's how the CCX compares to some of the top supercars in the world. It can't quite touch the newest stuff, but that's no surprise given that it's a bit slower and technology isn't as cutting edge, but it beats out the Veyron, which was its chief rival at the time. The CCX is a shockingly impressive car.